Hi, and welcome to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast. I've got a very special guest today. It's David Rudolf. How are you, David?
Steve, I'm fine. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, doing well under the circumstances. And got you on really because I've followed the Staircase murder trial with enjoyment. It has to be said in a lot of ways because I get really focused on crime. I've done this True Crime podcast now for the last few months, and a lot of the guests I've had on have been villains. So you're the first, the first legal eagle that I've had on the show, and somebody
you don't view me as a villain. That's good.
Yeah, you're definitely not a villain, but anyone who has watched The Staircase, will know who you are. Those who haven't, you must Google it. It was a fantastic trial which was played out in America, and we'll come to that in due course. But first of all, David, I just want to ask you, how did you become a lawyer?
Well, I wish I could say that it was my dream from when I was 4 years old, but that would be a lie. Actually, when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and so my parents suggested that I go to law school because, as they put it, it will keep your options open. And so I went to law school not knowing that I wanted to be a lawyer or what I wanted to do. But once I got there and I started taking courses in criminal law, I sort of fell in love with that aspect of law school. And so I took as many criminal law courses as I could. I took trial advocacy. I was in a clinical program where I actually represented people who were charged with minor crimes under supervision of another lawyer. And through that process, I think it became clear to me that this was something I really wanted to do.
You basically did 2 years in the Bronx, I think, and you went to the Federal Defender Office in Brooklyn. You tried a number of federal criminal cases out there. One of them included a case which was a hijacking of an airliner, I think, by a group of Croatians who were seeking independence from Yugoslavia.
It did, and I was a baby lawyer at the time, Steve. I was 2 years out of law school, if you can imagine. And this airplane gets hijacked by a bunch of Croatian nationalists at the time. Yugoslavia was still a country at that point. And they wanted Croatia to be free. And they hijacked this TWA plane. They flew it up to Montreal. They dropped leaflets. They then refueled it, changed planes, flew it over to Europe, circled around Paris, dropped more leaflets, and finally landed in Paris, where they were arrested and then brought back to the United States. So here I was, a baby lawyer, 2 years out of law school, and it's front page of the New York Times and every newspaper in the world at that point. And I get assigned to represent the American wife of the lead hijacker. And so that's how I spent the next year of my life, was doing that case.
Fascinating. And, how did the case pan out?
Well, most everybody was convicted. My client was convicted, but our defense was that she was just there because she wanted to be with her husband. She wasn't there to terrorize anybody or to serve any particular agenda. And the judge certainly sympathized with that defense. She was found guilty, but he sentenced her to be eligible for parole after 10 years, which was the lightest sentence that any of them got. And so she ended up being paroled early and then moved to Croatia, where she still lives.
In 1978, you were hired to start the criminal law clinic at the University of North Carolina School of Law. What was that like, taking a little bit of time out from defending people and encouraging new law students?
Well, I thought that was going to be my career path at that point, because I had really enjoyed doing the criminal law clinic at my law school at NYU. And I felt like this would be a great mix where I could keep my hand in it, but also help steer people to doing what I had done. encourage them to do that, and frankly, have more time off, have a little bit more leisure time. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, I did that for 4 years, and I just got bored. It was not enough to sustain my interest in what I was doing. It didn't matter if I went into class and I had a bad class. It didn't really matter. None of the students knew I had had a bad class. I knew it, but they didn't. And so I just decided I missed the courtroom and that I was going to get back in. And so after 4 years, I left the law school and went into private practice.
Yeah, 1982, you started your own firm with a colleague from Duke Law School. And was that always, always more rewarding going back into that? Did you feel that you'd finally, found your vocation in life?
Well, it was a little bit scary at the time because I had no real roots in North Carolina. My partner had no real roots in North Carolina. We had both been professors, he at Duke and me at UNC. So we just decided to give it a shot. And I didn't know whether it would last or whether I would end up moving back to New York or what I would do. But yeah, as soon as we got into it and we started getting cases, again, I realized that was really what my passion was, is representing people who were faced with the power of government. And whether that meant, defending them on the merits or whether it meant trying to explain to a prosecutor or a judge why they had done what they did to try to ameliorate the punishment. And once I started getting my own cases, I realized that's really where I was comfortable. It's where I felt like I could make a difference for people. It's where I felt like I could, to a certain extent, even out the playing field. And so here I am, 40 years later.
December the 9th, 2001 was a date which would not only change Michael Peterson's life, but also change your life. And there was an incident which took place at the Peterson household, which saw Kathleen Peterson, Michael's wife, end up at the bottom of the staircase. Sadly, she died, and the police and paramedics were called, and so began a quite remarkable case, because Michael Peterson's life changed forever, but so did yours. How did you first hear about the case, and how did you first get involved?
Well, you're right. It turned into a 15-year odyssey for me, which did have amazing repercussions for my life. But I knew about the case. I knew about the incident because I lived not far from where he lived. And so the local news had obviously covered it in great detail. I don't think at that point it was a national story. It was just a local story. But in any event, I had heard about it. I had read about it. And one day I got a call from Michael's brother, who was a lawyer in Nevada. And he had been calling around looking for North Carolina counsel to help Michael, and had gotten my name from various people. And he called me and he asked if I would be willing to go and meet with Michael to talk with him about representing him. At that point, it was pretty clear. He hadn't yet been charged, but it was pretty clear where it was going. And so I called my investigator, Ron Jarrett, who had worked with me on a number of high-profile cases before. And we traveled up to Durham to Michael's house and met with him in his house, where he took us through the events of that night.
What were your first impressions of Michael Peterson?
I had met Michael once before. His oldest son, Clayton, had been in some trouble a couple of years earlier. And Michael and Kathleen and Todd had come to my office just to sort of seek a second opinion about what was going on in Clayton's case. So I had met them just briefly, maybe for an hour or so. didn't have any strong impressions one way or the other. And I can't say that I liked him particularly. It was just a meeting. But when I went to his house that day, it was really clear to me that he was emotionally devastated by what had happened to Kathleen. There was no hiding the fact that this had really had a tremendous impact on him, and he was very emotional. He's not an emotional person, as you saw from the staircase, but he was very emotional that day. But now, for me and my investigator, we've been through this many times. And so we're trying to sit there and listen with a little bit of skepticism. You want to sort of hear if there's anything that doesn't quite sound right or that doesn't ring true to you. And we both agreed that everything that Michael said made sense within the context of his story. But then, of course, you have to go to the next step and say, okay, can we corroborate what he's saying? Are we satisfied that what he's told us is the truth? And so what you said about doing then, at least what we said about doing, was to check out a number of the facts he told us. So, for example, he told us he had rented this movie, America's Sweethearts, and that they were in the room there. He took us into the TV viewing room and told us he was sitting there, drinking wine, watching this movie. Well, we got the receipt from Blockbuster Video, which was still a thing back then. And sure enough, he had rented America's Sweethearts that night, 6 or 7 o'clock that night. He had told us that Todd, his son Todd, and a friend of Todd's, who was a medical doctor, had stopped by the house around 10 o'clock while they were watching the movie, just to say hello, because he hadn't seen Todd's friend in a while. So we called the medical doctor, and she confirmed that she and Todd had stopped off there, that everything was normal. There was no tension. They were having a good time. They were drinking wine. So that checked out as well. Then he had told us that a co-worker of Kathleen's had called late that night, somewhere in the vicinity of midnight, maybe a little bit before, to check on a work project they had to do the next morning, and that he had picked up the phone and answered it and then put Kathleen on. So we talked to that woman, and in fact, she confirmed that somewhere around midnight, she had called the house, that Michael had picked up the phone. They had a normal conversation, that she then talked with Kathleen. They had a normal conversation. There was nothing going on in the house. There was no yelling. There was no tension. Everything was normal. Michael told us that a couple of days before he had been offered or been told that a Hollywood producer was going to offer him a option on one of his books, and that's what they were celebrating that night. So we called the friend who had been his go-between with the Hollywood producer, and his friend confirmed that on that Friday, in fact, that's what he had told Michael. So each of these things sort of confirmed what Michael's story was, what he was telling us, and combined with our impression of Michael, I think we felt early on that he was telling us the truth.
As you prepared for the trial, it had become clear to you that the prosecution was going to try and make an issue of Michael's bisexuality. So, how did you approach that, and what was your views on that situation?
Well, Michael had admitted to us that he had sexual contact with men. Obviously that was a difficult thing to investigate because he felt reluctant to share the names of people and have us call up and say, oh, hey, by the way, did you have sex with Michael Peterson? So he had given us the names of some people, and we were doing some background investigation on those people. But my basic feeling was it was completely irrelevant. you know, what he did in the privacy of his own home or somebody else's home had nothing to do with what had gone on that night. So I wasn't terribly worried about it, other than the fact that it would be prejudicial to him if it came out. But of course, you know, the way it came out, the only way it came out was through this escort that he had been in contact with, who he had never actually met. He had simply been in phone contact with this person. And you know that if there had been a lot of other people, they would have found those people as well. So I don't think it was a major part of Michael's life, but it was a part of it. So we were hoping that we would keep it out of the trial. Unfortunately, we didn't.
Another curveball that you were thrown in this particular trial was the revelation that Liz Ratcliffe, who was a friend of Michael and his first wife, Patty, had died in Germany as well after falling down the stairs. So you had now a situation which had developed where it was being, you know, potentially or could be presented that this was maybe the work of a serial killer, that Michael Peterson had a knack, if you like, as we say in England, for throwing people downstairs and getting rid of them. What was your view when you heard that?
Well, let me start by correcting an impression that you may have had. She didn't fall down the stairs and die. She died from a cerebral hemorrhage.
Okay.
And I knew about that. We knew about that months and months and months before the prosecution moved to get her body autopsied, which is why we went to Germany. You know, in the documentary, it's not clear exactly when we went to Germany, but we went to Germany sometime about a year before the trial. So this was not a surprise to us. And we just figured, well, you know, actually my investigator figured, you know, they're going to try to use this in some way. So we flew to Germany and we spoke with the prosecutor in Germany, and he took out his file and we looked through his file. We had a German investigator who interpreted it for us. You know, we saw the reports from the German police, from the German doctor. We saw the reports from the American Army investigator who had gone to the scene. And everyone agreed, number one, there was no blood at the scene, or very little. Number two, that she had died of a brain hemorrhage. We knew that she had been having headaches for a couple of weeks before, that she had made a doctor's appointment to see what was going on because of those headaches. So, you know, the result of our investigation was that it didn't seem like to us that there was anything there to worry about, other than, as you put it, the coincidence of the fact that her body was found by the front door, which was at the bottom of a set of stairs. Other than that, there was nothing similar.
Yeah. I mean, the big concern must have been, from your view, that the jury, you know, would be influenced by, you know, this other case.
Absolutely. You know, we heard, how many times did we hear during the trial, you know, lightning doesn't strike twice, except if you happen to be the tree that it knocked down the second time. You know, I mean, there's lots of trees out there that have been struck by lightning twice. You know, our concern was, as you put it, with the impact on the jury. But, you know, the other thing to keep in mind is, in the interim between Elizabeth Ratliff's death and Kathleen Peterson's death, Michael had gotten divorced. He had gotten divorced from Patty, his first wife. Yet there she is in the courtroom, supportive of him. She didn't die on a staircase. And so how does one become a serial staircase murderer? You know, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you find a way to kill women on staircases once every 18 years. So, you know, when you really looked at it, didn't make a lot of sense, but it had superficial appeal. It had that appeal of lightning doesn't strike twice. And I think it had a real impact on the jury.
Were you concerned about a trial by media? Because it seems that, especially in America, from a Brit's perspective, there is saturation news coverage out there. And, this case was big news.
Yeah, it's a little different there, isn't it? In Great Britain, you're much more sensitive to the right of a fair trial than we are. Yeah, of course I was concerned about that, particularly when the autopsy results from Liz Ratliff were released publicly. I think we had done a pretty good job trying to counter the media as the case went along. That's part of the lawyer's job in the United States, is having to deal with the media and not just letting one side's narrative dominate the entire media perspective. And we had done, I think, a reasonable job of that. But then, of course, they dug up Elizabeth Ratliff's body. They drove her to Chapel Hill, 1,200 miles away. The TV crews followed the pickup truck from Texas to North Carolina. The TV crews were there in the morning when they carried the coffin out of the pickup truck and into the medical examiner's office. So that whole thing was was theater. It was complete theater, organized by the prosecution and the police. And then the medical examiner issues a report in which she finds that Elizabeth Ratliff was the victim of a, quote, homicidal attack, which I've never seen in any other autopsy. And then it gets released to the media. We moved to seal it for obvious reasons. I mean, this is all happening now 2 weeks before trial is to start. The jury notices have gone out. Everyone in that community knows they know I'm going to be on this jury. I've just got this notice. And now they're watching all this stuff on the news. And now they're going to come into court and have to judge Michael Peterson. And so it was, the timing of it and the way it was done was clearly meant to be prejudicial. And it was prejudicial. It took us literally 2 months to find people who could be fair.
The prosecution's case was obviously going to rely heavily on that, that examination, the autopsy, but they were also going to rely heavily on another person's evidence, and that was Dwayne Deaver. Tell us a little bit about Dwayne and what he brought to the table.
Well, what Dwayne brought to the table was junk science. That's what he brought to the table. Dwayne was a law enforcement officer. He was an SBI agent, State Bureau of Investigation agent. He was with the State Bureau of Investigation in North Carolina, the SBI. And he was called in by Art Holland, the investigator, Durham investigator, that very night. And Art Holland had already made up his mind that this was a murder. This was not an accident. Art walked into the house. He saw that blood. And he jumped to a conclusion. And so when Deaver arrived, Holland already told him what he thought had happened. So now Deaver is looking at all this with what we would call confirmation bias. He's got in his mind what happened, and now he's just looking for things that would support his theory. And the problem is that blood spatter, while it can tell you a few things about what happened, it can't tell you a whole lot, in terms of sequence of events or exactly what caused the bloodshed. It's somewhat limited. It's not, I wouldn't say it has no usefulness, but it's limited. And the problem was that, if Deaver had limited himself to the science, it wasn't really going to help Art Holland very much. And so Deaver went way beyond the science, and he claimed to be able to establish what he called points of origin that were, as he put it, out in space, so that rather than Kathleen hitting her head against a surface, whether it was a wall or a step or there was a little like an elevator thing for for handicapped access. Instead of her having hit her head against any surface, he decided that he could tell that her head had been struck while it was not on a surface, and therefore it had to have been struck by an object that somebody was swinging, and therefore it was Michael Peterson. The problem was that you can't determine a, quote, point of origin. It's impossible. The best you can do is an area of origin. And that area of origin is something like a ellipse that's 12 to 18 inches around. So that's the best you can do. The problem was that if he did that, the area of origin included walls and the floor. So that didn't really help Art Holland's case. So he went a step further and decided that he could tell these were out in space. And that was just made up, flat out made up. And it took us a long time to be able to prove that.
You decided against having Mike Peterson testify. Why was that?
A few reasons. Number one, he couldn't really add very much to what we could do as lawyers. In other words, he wasn't there. He didn't see what happened to Kathleen. All he could say was, I was outside by the pool and I came in and there she was lying there. So that didn't really add anything to our case. Second of all, Michael had some baggage to him. Number one, he would have been cross-examined about this bisexuality. Number two, he would have been cross-examined about what happened in Germany. And even though he could have answered those questions, it would have just reminded the jury towards the close of the case about things that we felt we had already dealt with pretty successfully when they came up. And so we didn't want that to be ringing in the jurors' ears when they went back to deliberate. And then finally, we felt like there was more than a reasonable doubt in this case. Once we found that blowpoke, I honestly thought there's no way. There's no way that a jury can convict him when the alleged murder weapon has been found and it's not the murder weapon. And so you don't want to, if you have a reasonable doubt case, once you put your client on the stand, it becomes much more of does the jury believe him or do they not believe him? Reasonable doubt sort of disappears and it becomes much more a credibility question for the jury. And I was concerned about that. So for all of those reasons, everybody, it wasn't just me, it was everybody who was involved in that defense. We had a huge meeting. I think there's a clip of that in the staircase where we went around the table and everybody agreed there was no reason to put him on the stand, and there was lots of downside to putting him on the stand. And so we did.
You found out a few weeks before the trial started that the prosecution were going to argue that a blowpoke was the murder weapon. Now, this blowpoke, wasn't available. It hadn't been found. And then mysteriously, it turned up. What was the story behind that?
Well, it was interesting because, the blowpoke was not the alleged murder weapon until sometime during the spring, just before the trial started. And it became the murder weapon because Candace Zamperini, Kathleen's sister, decided at some point that she hadn't seen this blowpoke that she had given to Kathleen years earlier when she went to the house after Kathleen's death. I don't know what caused her to suddenly realize that, but so she went to the police and she said, aha, I know what it was. I gave Kathleen this blowpoke years ago. I've got one of my own. Here it is. And when I went to Kathleen's house after her death, it was missing. So that became the mysteriously missing murder weapon. Now, the police had searched that house several times, but the last time they had searched it was June of 2002, before the blowpoke was a murder weapon, before anyone knew what the murder weapon was going to be. And so they had actually found it down in the boiler room of the garage, a sort of an old garage downstairs. But they thought it was a curtain rod or something. And so they put it back in the boiler room, which is where it was found. Now, I have to tell you, Steve, that I was suspicious when I heard that they had found that, in part because the police had searched the house, and I wasn't really putting together the timeline of why they would have missed it if they searched the house back in June. But more importantly, it was just odd, that suddenly it turned up. And Clayton was the person who found it one evening. And my concern was not that Michael had put it there. My concern was that one of those kids trying to help their father had somehow found or gotten a hold of a blowpoke and put it down there to help their dad. That was my concern. And I think you can see during the staircase, when I find out about it and I go to the house, I am skeptical. I didn't just fall off the truck. So I'm skeptical. And I'm saying to them, is this real? How did this happen? But then we went downstairs. And as you saw, that blowpoke was covered in spider webs and dead bugs. It clearly had been there for months, not days. And that's why we got a photographer to come and take those pictures, because we thought it was really important to show that it had been there for quite some time. And Ron Jarrett very carefully, after we photographed it in place, took it and put it in a plastic tube to preserve it exactly as it was. So that's how we found it. I honestly thought at that point, this case is over. How can they ever convict him now?
Well, Bob made reference to the Staircase documentary. I mean, first of all, how did that come about? And secondly, did you find that a help or a hindrance?
Well, it came about early on in the case. I had been contacted by the people who had done a documentary called Murder on a Sunday Morning, which, if your listeners haven't seen, it's a great documentary about a public defender in Florida. And they had won an Academy Award for Best Documentary the year before. And they had somehow gotten my name just to call me to see if I knew of any cases, because they wanted to do a documentary about another case. And their whole goal was really to explore the American justice system. It wasn't about a particular case. They didn't really care about which case it was. They wanted to dive into the American justice system. And so they got my name and they called me, and I was skeptical, and I wasn't really interested, but they had just won an Academy Award, which was fairly impressive. And so I figured, well, I'm not going to have a chance to meet very many Academy Award winners in my life, so no harm. Let's have them come up and meet with us. And they did. I was impressed by the fact that they were interested in really understanding the criminal justice system. They really did want to understand what the role of a defense lawyer was, and really what the role of a prosecutor was. when they started filming, they were filming the prosecutors as well as us, different camera crews, but they were filming. And then about a month or two into it, the prosecution decided they weren't going to allow that. So they were left with us. And I decided that there was some real value in people seeing the inside, the workings of the justice system, and how criminal defense lawyers go about doing what they do. Because popular culture had sort of made us into the bad guys, made us into the villains, made us into the cheats and the people who bend the rules just to get guilty people off. And I thought it was important for people to understand what criminal defense lawyers actually do, as opposed to the popular culture stereotype. So that was my motivation for ultimately agreeing. And Michael just felt like the prosecution and the police were going to be prejudiced against him because of a number of the columns he had written over the years. He was a columnist in the local newspaper, had been very critical of the police and the prosecution and city government for that matter. And he was convinced that they were going to cheat. And he thought having a French film crew that had just won an Academy Award in Durham filming everything might keep the playing field a little bit more level. And that's why he agreed to it. So just a few months after the trial started, they were there. And I have to say that it was an interesting experience. And I think at the end of the day, a really valuable documentary was created as a result of it.
Certainly was. Going into that final part of the trial, the jury is sent out. How confident were you? And then how did you feel when the verdict came in?
Steve, when the jury first went out, I thought this has got to be an acquittal. Nobody who sat through that trial, and I'm talking about the court security officers, the media, court TV, spectators there in the courtroom, nobody thought that Michael Peterson was going to get convicted, and certainly I didn't. But then the deliberations dragged on, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, fifth day. And I started feeling like there must be some people in there who just won't vote not guilty because of the Germany thing, because of the bisexuality. So at that point, I sort of decided it's got to be a hung jury, and so when they finally came back in and they had a verdict, well, then I thought, okay, well, I guess they finally resolved it, and here comes, the not guilty. And so when they said guilty, I was devastated. I was really shocked. And the truth is that while Michael put up a brave face there in the courtroom, Jean, the filmmaker, told me later on that when he went back to film Michael in the jail, Michael was sobbing and just couldn't be consoled. So what you saw in the documentary when he turns to his daughters and says, "Don't worry, it'll be all right," that completely disintegrated, 5 minutes later.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, we keep talking about it, but the documentary is well worth a watch if anybody hasn't watched it. Couple of things before we finish, David. I've got to ask you, what is the owl theory? I'm sure that my people who watch this channel will find this fascinating.
All right. Well, the owl theory was not something that existed when I tried the case. We had all looked at the wounds on Kathleen's scalp, and they were unusual, to say the least. I'm sure that you can describe them to your viewers better than I can, but they almost looked like the claws of a bird, but we weren't thinking that way then. And so our expert had explained that when a skull hits the floor, it's a round object, and it's going to crack the way a pumpkin might crack. So one impact can cause splits, is what our expert said. And so our theory was you had 3 or 4 impacts, and then these sort of jagged lines emanating from the middle were splits, and that's what we thought. Well, then towards the very end of the trial, I mean, literally after all the evidence was in and we were preparing for closing argument, this fellow named Larry Pollard, who was a neighbor, came to my office, and he told me, I think I know what happened to Kathleen. We have these barred owls in the neighborhood, and I think one of these owls attacked Kathleen outside the house, and that's what caused these wounds on her scalp, and then she ran into the house and collapsed in the stairway. So that was the theory. None of us gave any credence to it at the time. It became sort of a running joke in Durham because Larry really hadn't done his homework in trying to support his theory. But as time went on, and as people learned more and more about barred owls and more of these incidents occurred, in fact, barred owls attack human beings. Now, if you go on Google and you Google, owls attacking humans, you will find newspaper stories, you will find video, you will find photographs of people who have been attacked by owls. Then a lot of the facts that we really didn't quite understand at the time, like the shape of her wounds, like the fact that there were blood drops on the stairway leading up to the house, the front door, like there was a blood smear on the door frame of the front door. All of it, like there was a feather found in her hands in dried blood, that there was a twig found on the staircase, which we assume came from the Christmas tree they put up, but could have come from being deposited by a bird. So all these facts that we really didn't quite understand and really didn't play a role in the trial suddenly took on new significance. And so, there's a Netflix trailer on the owl theory, which I encourage your listeners to watch. I've got a web page on myself in which I discuss all of the episodes, and at the end I discuss the owl theory. And we'll leave it to your listeners to decide for themselves whether it's plausible or not. It seems to me it's plausible.
Certainly appear to me plausible. It's fascinating. And, David's got his own website, davidsrudolf.com. Definitely worth a visit because, as David's quite rightly pointed out, he gives an inside view into the Staircase trial on there. And it's fascinating reading that. It's a great accompaniment to watching the documentary. So, as we all know, an appeal process can develop from a conviction. Michael, of course, was given life with no chance of parole. But over a succession of years, the appeal process, which is slow, took place. You were involved in most of that. I know you did dip out at one point, but then came back to the fold. Michael didn't really want to put his family through another trial, though, and again, this is something which is relevant to Americans, but not to people in Britain. He decided to enter what is called an Alford plea. So, can you describe what that is and what the outcome was for Michael?
Yes, it's a uniquely American procedure, and it's a compromise procedure. So, Michael was adamant that he was not going to ever say that he killed Kathleen. But we wanted this case to be over. We had gotten him a new trial. He didn't want to go through another trial. So what I suggested was that we try to negotiate what's called, as you put it, an Alford plea. And that's simply where you enter a plea of guilty, but you maintain your innocence. You basically say, I didn't do this. I didn't kill Kathleen, but I'm going to enter this plea of guilty, not because I'm guilty, but because I don't want to go through the agony of another trial. I don't want to go through the agony of having my family go through another trial. I don't want to bet on the fairness of the system anymore when the system has already shown itself to be unfair. And so that was how we proceeded. You'll see at the end, if you haven't already seen it, how that all unfolds. It was a way of putting this case to bed. It didn't satisfy, in a sense, anybody. Certainly, would I have rather gotten a not guilty at the end of the day? Sure, I would have, but it wouldn't have been fair to Michael. He was over 70 years old at that point. He just needed to get on with his life.
How's Michael doing today?
He's doing all right. He's writing. He's living in Durham, which I wouldn't have done, but that's where he is. He visits his grandchildren and his kids. Before the pandemic, he was going to the gym quite regularly, and he's living on a pension, a fairly modest pension, and he's doing the things that a 75-year-old grandfather does these days.
And yourself, are you still practicing, David?
I am. Well, after the Staircase trial, I sort of shifted into doing representing people who had been wrongfully convicted. And I know you've had your share of those there in Great Britain, a lot of them coming out of the Troubles. But I decided that I was going to focus my attention on trying to get compensation for people who had been wrongfully convicted. And so the last decade or so, that's been my focus. And I've been fortunate to represent a number of those people. I've been fortunate to get them real compensation, not that it really made up for the decades they spent in prison, but at least they were able to get on with their lives. And so that's what I've been doing. I'm in the process of writing a book about the abuse of power in the criminal justice system. And I've got a contract with a publisher. So that book should be coming out probably sometime in 2021. And then I'm working on a podcast, and the podcast is called Abuse of Power. I'm doing it with my wife and law partner, Sonia Pfeiffer, who I met during the Staircase, to talk about it having an impact on my life. We're now married. She was a reporter at the time, and then ended up going to law school afterwards, and then became a public defender here in Charlotte, and we ended up getting married. The podcast is one that we do together that explores the various kinds of abuses that take place in the criminal justice system, and it's a pretty in-depth look. We look at individual cases. We talk with the people who were adversely affected. We talk with experts. We talk with their lawyers. Sonia and I discuss the cases from our perspective, since we've both done these kinds of cases. And our premiere episode, which is now out and available on Apple Podcasts, is an episode on systemic racism in the American justice system. And we've gotten really good feedback about it. People seem to enjoy it. It's available right now wherever you get your podcasts, and the regular series will start on August 10th.
Superb, David. You can also follow David on Twitter at David S. Rudolf, and as I said, his website at davidsrudolf.com. And there's a very important link on the website, and that is the Ron Garrett Memorial Fund. As many of you will know who've already watched The Staircase, Ron Garrett was the investigator, of course, who was a big part of the case and was a lifelong friend, of course, of David. And basically, there's a donate to the Ron Garrett Memorial Fund on there, which I know that David is going to match. He's aiming to hit a certain amount of money on there. So please donate to that if you get the time on David's website. David, I could, as always, speak to you all night. It's been an absolute pleasure having you as my guest on the podcast. The very best of luck with your own podcast. I'll certainly be giving that a listen, and good luck with the book. And of course, you do a lot of events, and I know you ventured across to the UK, which of course is where I met you with my good friend Neil Jackson from Media Arts. You were kind enough to meet us for breakfast one morning after the show, which was we're eternally grateful for. But people, hopefully, if they can follow you on Twitter, will find out when you're next back in the UK after the COVID outbreak.
Well, you won't let us in now. We've been barred from Great Britain, which is, that's probably appropriate.
But David, listen, thanks for your time. Love to the family. Stay safe, and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thanks very much, Steve.